Good evening and welcome to Avid Bookshop's event with Henry Cowles and Jamie Kreiner. Here are their two books, both available at avidbookshop.com. And we would really appreciate your support of us and of the authors. One of the things that we love doing at Avid is hosting really robust, interesting in-person events, and we have not been able to do so for the last year. So we closed our doors to the public in mid-March last year, and we'll be opening again for browsing at some point after the pandemic has slowed down, but for now we're closed, and we really are genuinely grateful to all of you who have shopped with us and with other independent local bookstores that you love. You have kept us in business, and we've also been able to make payroll every single period all throughout the pandemic, which is really rare and really impressive, and it's all because of your support for us. So thank you so much. We've had a blast hosting author events on Zoom. I want to thank our events department for putting together really extraordinary author events. And I have to admit, some of the ones that are closest to our hearts are when our customers, like Jamie Kreiner, are here to present their work. And Jamie invited Henry, and the two of them worked together to put together this evening for us. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Jamie Kreiner and Henry Cowles in their event sponsoring their brand new books available at Avid Bookshop or wherever your independent local bookstore is. Thanks so much for being here, and we'll check in with you again at the end of the event. Welcome, authors.
Thanks so much for having us, Janet, and thanks to Avid Bookshop for hosting us tonight. Henry and I thought we would introduce ourselves and give you the layout of our plan really briefly, in part because this is a split audience, and some of you know Henry and some of you know me. I am Jamie Kreiner. I'm on the history faculty at the University of Georgia. I'm a historian of the early Middle Ages. And Henry?
So I'm Henry Cowles. I'm on the faculty in the history department at the University of Michigan, and I'm a historian of science and medicine in the modern period.
So we work on totally different stuff, except that we're both historians. And so this pairing might seem kind of weird, but it's in a way kind of natural to us because we've been working and thinking together for a long time. We met in grad school. We were just a few years apart in the program at Princeton, and we have been talking about our work in earlier projects. These two books in particular, we wrote basically in the same year and traded our chapters back and forth. So there's a lot of, like, at least I can speak for myself, there's a lot of good ideas I got from Henry that basically are purloined and now in Legions of Pigs. So
it goes both ways, Jamie.
So there's a lot of common threads in this work anyway, and we thought it would be fun to talk about that together tonight. But first, Henry is going to tell you what our plan is.
It's really basic, and it's obviously pending my terrible Wi-Fi. So the plan is that we're going to just start by introducing our two books, maybe 2 or 3 minutes each, just for those of you who haven't read them cover to cover. And then we'll go from there in a kind of mutual Terry grossing, kind of asking one another questions that are points of overlap between us. And then I guess it's worth mentioning now that when we start doing that, you can start submitting questions via the chat, or at least I think that's a possibility. Is that right, Jamie?
Yeah, well, Henry and I will sort of keep an eye on the chat as we go. So if a question comes up that you'd want us to answer during our convo, we'll just punt it to the person in the process.
Yeah, and then so we're going to ask each other a few questions back and forth, and then we think probably about 7:45 we'll turn it over to totally reading the questions from the chat. But before then, I guess, Jamie, do you want to get started?
Yeah, sure. So you've already seen it, but I really like the cover, so you can see it again. Legions of Pigs, that's the one I wrote. It's a study about how and why pigs mattered in the early medieval West. So chronologically speaking, that's roughly 400 to 1000 CE. Geographically, it ranges across what was the former western half of the Roman Empire. So basically North Africa up to the British Isles, Atlantic to the Rhine. But it takes glances further afield at Libya, Eastern Europe, and Scandinavia. Anyway, the pigs part. It seems like a small subject today, but in the early Middle Ages, pigs were a really important part of economies and diets. And unlike today, they were also highly visible. So they were ubiquitous, they were nearly everywhere, and people knew it. Kind of like how in Athens today, you see dogs and cats and cardinals and think nothing of it. It was that way with pigs, except in the early Middle Ages, pigs were also more like coworkers. And because people knew the species really well and paid close attention to them, they knew that some of the benefits of pig raising, obviously, that pigs were adaptable eaters, and that's what made them a useful resource for converting all sorts of stuff in the environment that humans didn't want into pork. People also noticed, again, because of their close working relationship with pigs, that they weren't just instruments or objects or food. They were also creatures that were capable of socialization and learning, and it made them difficult to completely domesticate. So pigs were also historical actors that caused problems and opportunities that humans learned to accommodate. So the book is about how pigs both supported and scrambled the plans that humans set for them. And in the process, pigs ended up affecting early medieval politics, economics, and culture. And so pigs can take us on a tour of early medieval farming communities and the farmers and landowners and swineherds who worked with them. They also draw us into legal conflicts and to the fiscal and ethical calculations that institutions like monasteries and courts made. And pigs also guide us into the nerdier world of exegesis or biblical commentary, and to the kind of layered symbolic associations that Christians came to assign pigs in the process of getting to know them so well. And so by tracking those interactions between pigs and environments and people, the book also ends up exploring more widely what early medieval humans thought about the non-human world more generally and their relationship to it. And so a big argument in Legions of Pigs is that people were always paying attention to the links between big things and small things, and that we should be doing that too. And that's my very brief summary. Henry, your turn.
That was it. It's such a good book, and I wish we could just talk about that. But I wrote another one. I don't have the actual cover because I've had it out of the cover, but it has the, thank you, Jamie. It has the inauspicious title, The Scientific Method, and that's where I'll start, actually. So it's kind of the end of the book is the rise of this thing that we still teach to kids today, the 5-step scientific method. So this idea that you solve a problem by asking a question, formulating a hypothesis, designing an experiment, running the experiment, and then either redoing it or arriving at a result, right? That's the kind of basic 5-step method you see on posters and that gets taught to kids in introductory science books still today. And so the book began with the question, where did that come from? Because scientists don't think that's how science works, and historians and philosophers don't think that's how science works. So it's this kind of strange puzzle. Peeling back the layers of that history, so the first answer was really easy to come by. It comes from a short list that the philosopher John Dewey published in 1910. So, okay, great, problem solved. So where I went from there was to dig back further and further, kind of one layer at a time, to figure out the questions Dewey was trying to answer, all the way back to whatever I could find as a kind of starting point. And what I found there was kind of surprising and not so dissimilar from Jamie's pigs. So Dewey formulates this method that we still teach to children by watching children learn things in the classroom, by watching them play, by watching them just interact with one another. He thought he could see a kind of algorithmic process in the way that we address every kind of dilemma from a very, very young age. But it turns out that that kind of classroom-based work that he was doing was in dialogue with a bunch of psychologists studying how rats and cats and dogs and chickens learn to solve problems. So for Dewey, the special animal was the child, but he was in dialogue with these people studying this whole menagerie of psychological objects in the 1880s and 1890s. And when you peel that layer back, you see a whole set of strange evolutionary theorists and proto-psychologists and people in a wide range of fields across the 19th century, basically asking the same question, which was, when we solve problems in everyday life as animals, as humans, do we have something in common? Is there a kind of basic way we approach the world? And when you follow that all the way back to the early 19th century, you find a kind of strange political moment, which is the beginning of the story, which is the desire to formulate a way of solving problems that wasn't radical, often described as French, kind of reductive, deductive, principle-based reasoning. But it also wasn't totally boring fact grubbing. It wasn't just like building lists of facts together and hoping a result would come about. It was some kind of balance between the two. And it's that desire for balance, this kind of weird political moderation, somewhere between the hyper radical and the hyper conservative, that's the beginning of the story, that ends up producing this scientific method that we still teach to kids today. And so that's the basic run of the story in reverse that I then started out from 1830 to about 1910.
Yeah, I think one of the things that is so neat about what you do in your book is that both the book and your actors make scientists not just the agents of the story, but also their own subjects for inquiry and reflection, as this ongoing kind of cycle where their output is based on their own observations of themselves and each other, in addition to that menagerie you talk about. So I was wondering if you could say more about how, I mean, this talk is about scientists and pigs. Let's talk about those actors. How do your scientists change the way we're thinking about the history of science or the scientific method?
Yeah, it's obviously a great question that we've talked about a lot, Jamie. I think the first thing to note is that the term scientist itself, though it's coined at a moment that's described in the book early on, it actually doesn't become the standard way that we refer to people like that until the early 20th century. So for most of the story, that would have been a kind of unfamiliar and even ugly term for the people that we're talking about. And
can you say why ugly?
They just kind of thought it was like, they had a couple different analogies. It was supposed to be like artist, but other people heard it like pianist or sciolist. There was something about it that didn't sound right. The alternative that a lot chose was actually a gendered term, men of science. That was the kind of preferred approach, which obviously had its own problems as science changed over the course of the late 19th century. But the other thing to highlight, and this is something that we've gone back and forth about a lot, was that often this kind of reflexive work they were doing, where they were kind of really worried about how they were thinking, so they looked at other animals to see if they were kind of thinking the same way, was inadvertent or accidental. So they didn't mean to be self-obsessed and kind of thinking about their method constantly while they were working on other problems. It just kind of emerged as a consequence of their anxiety about their status. This is especially true in the social sciences and psychology in particular, because there was this dilemma of, am I a real scientist, or are people taking me seriously as a scientist? Are they just calling me a philosopher, right? These kinds of like standard anxieties that people might feel ended up shaping the kind of work that they did. So onto every study of a cat learning how to escape from a box, or onto, right, like children learning things in the laboratory, got grafted this kind of hyper defense of their particular methods so often that it kind of bled into the description of these kids and these animals, which is where you get this kind of naturalizing tendency in the book itself. But let's think about pigs. So I was really struck, Jamie, and those who've already read the book know this, but the very, very first line of the preface, not of the introduction, it was the pigs who pushed me into this. And you've got a claim about why that is, and these are historical pigs, not pigs that you might see around you in Athens today. But I guess the question is, how did they push you in? How do historical pigs from the early Middle Ages speak across that millennium to you? Where did you find, maybe if you have a particular pig you'd like to talk about that you discovered somewhere, we would love to hear about it.
Like I'm always telling my students, I think it's really good to read cues when you're, pouring through the historical evidence of stuff that pops out as weird to you, or maybe even annoying, or as a surprise. When I was working on my dissertation, which was on basically what's now France in the early Middle Ages, I was looking at, like totally regular kinds of documents, like law codes, royal decrees, hagiography, and pigs just kept coming up in important places. Like it wasn't just like someone would mention in passing, about this animal. There was concerted effort to address the issue of pigs in many of these texts. And I obviously thought it was weird. It helped that I'd taken a class in grad school on rural history, so I knew it might be worth digging into, but I put it on the back burner, and they just kind of kept bothering me. And for those of you guys who are students, definitely pay attention to the stuff that bothers you. Sometimes it leads you to really cool places. The pigs that I, caught my eye in the first place were ones who kept coming up in the law codes as causing damage. It turns out it's not easy to raise pigs. In the past, people would sort of describe them as kind of ideal converters of whatever into meat, but they come with a lot of trade-offs. And these laws made it clear. They destroy fences, they escape from fences because they're so social, they learn from each other and teach each other how to jump fences because they can jump up to 4 feet. They can swim, they root when they are on the land, so they cause a lot of damage that way. They can also root up corpses, they can attack children. They've also were documented as killing other farm animals when they're locked up with them. So these are the pigs that I liked best because, you know, they encapsulated something which I see a lot in your book. Your scientists as both objects and subjects. Pigs are quintessentially that. They're not just bacon. They're also intervening in a lot of human arrangements that then have to be reconfigured to accommodate them.
So let me ask a follow-up, Jamie. Did we forget that? Like, did the people in the early Middle Ages, they recognized this omnivory in all these senses of the pig. But did we modern folks forget how intelligent they are and only relearn it recently? Like,
anyone who works with them knows this, even in modern industrial conditions. And in fact, there's really excellent modern biobehavioral research on pigs precisely because people recognize how smart they are. And even though they live awful lives in confinement, one of the goals is to try to make their lives somewhat more pleasant, if only to increase net profits in the end. So a lot of researchers who are concerned about animal welfare have done really great work on pig cognition, pig behavior, which lines up weirdly often with what the ancient early medieval material tells us. But we as a whole have definitely forgot, people who are not farmers or researchers. I mean, I think a lot of people have told me, oh yes, pigs are really smart. Like, I think that's something is sort of well known, but the details of it not known at all. And in the same way that people really get to know dogs by having one, you know, people really got to know their pigs by having them in the early Middle Ages and still do, but most of us don't keep pigs anymore because they're mostly invisible. They kind of worked their way out of our lives in that way. I mean, this makes me wonder, you know, too, about some of the invisible forces that are at play in both of our work, because our characters in these histories both noticed and didn't notice some of the things that were affecting their lives. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, you know, in your case, the role of animals and the role of ecologies in particular, the ecologies of the early Middle Ages are so obvious and so captivating. Obvious because you wrote about them, not obvious to me as someone who doesn't know anything about it. For me, some of the forces are a little bit more hidden. So one in particular that ended up being really important in the book was this idea that I actually pulled out of more recent cognitive science, which is that the tools that we use to solve problems end up not just shaping the solutions we arrive at, but becoming the solutions. So the obvious answer that people, or the obvious kind of example of this that people give is when computers entered the social sciences in the 20th century, that's when you get this idea of the mind as a kind of information processing computer, right? It's only once we're familiar with the devices that the object in question takes on its features. In my case, it's a little stranger. It's like so for example, using animal models to study human cognition, right? So running rats in mazes and that kind of thing. It's almost inadvertently the case that, or kind of as a knock-on effect of that decision, that human problem solving takes on this kind of animal quality in their hands, right? So rather than some of the researchers that I study really wanted to exalt human intelligence. It's somehow different, superior to non-human intelligence. But by using these non-human kind of examples or models, they end up getting kind of foiled, right? There's this kind of power that the tool that they're using has over their desires to theorize in a particular way. And they end up producing this more animalistic model of science as a result. So again, it's that kind of the force of accident. I mean, would you say that animals in your story kind of produce a similar accidental or happenstantial historical pattern, or is it something different?
I guess I wouldn't use the word accident. I'd use a concept you and I have talked about a lot, which is non-conscious non-conscious cognitive operations, or just, there's something that makes a kind of intuitive sense to people when they have a particular tool or working relationship that then informs the way they think, but they haven't decided, I will apply this to this other domain and see what happens. So, pigs end up, to stick with the idea of metaphors, pigs become a totally commanding metaphor in early medieval Christianity, especially toward the Central Middle Ages. And it's not because people were like, let us find an animal that kind of solves a lot of symbolic issues for us. It was that, these ongoing working relationships that were just a facet of people's lived environments, just fed into the ways that they tried to make sense of things that were complex. So, for example, pigs had some of the same connotations they do now, dirtiness, greediness, but they also had this sort of other ream of positive identifications that they acquired in Christian culture, particularly the idea of being a kind of sacrifice. So people thought a lot about how their lives depended on the deaths of other animals, and that in some way human life wouldn't be possible without those deaths. And so when they started thinking about a death that was really complicated and that really mattered a lot to them, which was the death of Jesus, something that kind of vertiginous and impossible to understand was made a little bit more comprehensible by comparing it to a kind of sacrifice that they did know, which is of animals. So, the idea of meatiness, pig being the quintessential neediness, the idea of sacrifice through the animal, it's not that they said, Jesus' death and sacrifice is absolutely equivalent, but they were focalizing it through experiences they knew really well.
Would it be fair to say that, I'm so foolish on this stuff, but because pigs must be killed to be used as comestibles, unlike dairy cows, unlike chickens with their eggs, that they are especially sacrificial as compared to these other animals, sheep, for example?
Yeah, because pigs really didn't have secondary products, they were just being raised for their meat. They were seen as the animal that was meat, even though actually they weren't the most commonly eaten meat. But they, sort of in the symbolic world of the early Middle Ages, were meatiness. And so, yeah, then in Latin, the word caro, flesh, meat, sort of straddled the semantics there of both the flesh in the sort of elevated Christian sense of having a material world be the medium for salvation, and then caro, meat, like this is what you have on your dinner plate. The pig was really convenient in sort of drawing the connections between them.
Jamie, there's a question in the chat, and I just want to, before you answer, I just want to highlight that Jamie's book is full of examples of pigs being useful in all kinds of ways that aren't how they were eaten. That was my simplistic reading. But go ahead, Jamie.
But yes, this question, pigs were not really used for fertilizer. They may have been on occasion, but it was the fertilizer. It was the manure of sheep and goats and cattle that were more important. Pigs could also be used for leather products, but it was always for like secondary stuff like bags or the equivalent of cardboard boxes for shipping. Like pig leather wasn't going to be a really fancy kind of leather.
But they could eat stuff. If you needed a lot of different stuff eaten all at once, they could do that for you.
Yes. Sorry, I feel like it's really hard now for me to like turn this back to your work.
No. So I have a way. I have a proposal.
Okay, I'll let you turn it back to yourself.
So in the late 19th century, when these different scientific fields are kind of on this human-animal boundary, so thinking about, still pretty anthropocentric, thinking about human issues in human minds, but looking for non-human animals through which to study them, there's actually a really interesting kind of tension that emerges, because the animal has to be close enough to humans in various ways, and what close means changes, to be a legitimate model of human cognition, for example. So you want to be able to say, like, for example, insects weren't used in this way, right? They were so clearly different that they weren't really a good example of human problem solving, for example. But they couldn't be so close that that you couldn't like lock them up in cages for days at a time, right? You needed to be able to do these kinds of things, including eventually pretty widespread vivisection for like physiological understanding of human systems. So the use of non-human animals operates on this knife's edge of needing to be close enough to be recognizably human in some way, but needing to be far enough that you can do inhuman things to them for the purpose of science. And the rhetoric that emerges is exactly the same rhetoric, Jamie. It's the rhetoric of sacrifice and of kind of suffering for science. So the same, and there are all these like kind of almost beatific images of like dogs sacrificed so that we can know more about our internal organs, right? In this kind of like they're on a crucifix in a very similar way to the way pigs were talked about in your period in the late 19th century.
Well, man, I wish we could share screens so you could show an image of this kind of iconography.
It's both bizarre and actually weirdly familiar from campaigns from the late 20th century by PETA and others about this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, yes, because it could absolutely be mobilized in the inverse and used to say, this is the reason this shouldn't happen.
Exactly.
Now, how do they approach this problem when dealing with children, which are, of course, a much more liminal case and often the children of the researchers, right?
They are often the children of the researchers in the beginning of child studies. So Darwin makes extensive notes and publications about a couple of his children and his dogs. Dogs and children kind of vie for priority in this world. There's obviously no informed consent in this period. There's clearly no consent provided by the children. But as psychologists enter schools, and often they found these schools. So if anyone's here from the University of Chicago, the laboratory school, the famous lab school, is founded for precisely this reason, right? To provide children with an education with a veneer of experimentalism. So if you know anything about the lab school, you know that it's like a laboratory in the sense that children do experiments all the time. They learn by doing. But the real like reason it was founded was to make the children into lab rats in order to better understand how children and humans think and how teaching works, right? So there's this kind of double meaning there. And that's the way that it often gets justified. So doing these experiments on children, which are not locking them up in boxes necessarily, but like subjecting them to terribly boring puzzles over and over again, that it doesn't necessarily require the permission of parents because it's worked into the curriculum and the agreements are worked out at the level of superintendents. And it always seems like the kinds of games that are happening in classrooms anyway. And I will say, the puzzles are boring, the puzzles are difficult, but I think a lot of late 19th century primary school education was boring and difficult. Probably it still is. And so it wasn't that strange for psychologists to be kind of enrolling children in these studies in lieu of lab rats and cats.
Well, and totally appropriate given that this isn't in your book, but an article that you're working on now, which you guys, the title is so great, Psychology is Boring. This work that kids were doing in schools is not unlike how boring psychology was becoming at the end of the 19th century.
You can see glimmers of this towards the end of the book, that basically psychology, I mean, if you think about it, right, psychology is basically one of the most interesting things that there is, right? It's like these fundamental questions about how and why we think what we do, how we navigate the world, how we interact with each other. But on a practical level, in the late 19th century, it became extremely boring. It was about using your stopwatch to time how long it took people to react to certain stimuli, to solve really boring puzzles, right? It became obsessively quantitative in a way that basically there were people who objected. So William James is a famous objector to this mode of psychology. He thought it was terrible, it was ruining the field. But the vast majority of new practitioners in the late 19th century defended this boring psychology as basically what it meant to do science. Like if you were going to be a science, it had to be boring. And that's this very strange, I mean, maybe that's not strange to people who took a couple science classes and never did again, but that's new in the late 19th century as a kind of professional dictum. And in some ways we still suffer the consequences.
I mean, historians sometimes joke about how boring their work is. I know Claudio is here, he has complained about this. But I also think in some ways, when you do intellectual history, like both of our books kind of fall in that category, it feels a little bit like we've jumped the line. Like it doesn't often feel boring. I think in part because we get access to historical complaints about their own lives in a way that is much more interesting. 1 degree removed from the boringness and suddenly it becomes interesting again.
Do you think though that like think of your book, for example. There's the intellectual history that you're doing in some of those chapters of the exegetes or of the people who are writing about agriculture or the cosmos. But then there are the things they are writing about, including the pigs. Is there an intellectual history of pigs? Or is that a different kind of history? If you're writing about how they think and how they navigate their spaces?
There probably could not be one for the early Middle Ages, but there probably could be one now when you have more, when the evidence is more abundant to which we have access. One thing that was particularly frustrating when I was doing this book was how little I could get even into the minds of swineherds. We barely even have their names from the historical documentation. And, this was well before people started writing how-to manuals and all sorts of stuff that comes with the early modern period. So knowing the kind of tacit knowledge, the kind of things swineherds would have had to know to do a good job. Lots of inference, lots of like juicy tidbits that don't go much further.
I mean, there's another lesson here, though, for students, kind of like the one you began with, right? Which is that if you keep butting up against a problem, like I wish I knew what swineherds knew, you've identified part of the answer, which is that there are all sorts of reasons it didn't get written and passed down. But one of them is that it's this kind of craft-based practice, right? It's the kind of thing that wasn't written down because it was assumed to be passed down between certain kinds of people. Why would it have been written down, right? So it produces that kind of move, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we have better evidence for how much other people respected what they knew and so little about the common sense of what was required. The common sense and the expertise. I don't want to give it short shrift. I mean, did you come across anything like that when you were researching or writing your book? Like things you really wanted to find and then the absence of it taught you something anyway?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's in the book and it's something that, we probably both teach to students in different ways, but there's one of the things that gets constructed in this period that I write about is this, and it's not new, but it gets constructed in a new way, is a kind of universal subject or the universal mind, right? This idea that we all solve problems in the same way. And you can take all these different kinds of minds, right? These particular cats in this attic at Columbia, these particular kids in this classroom in Chicago, in the case of anthropology, people all over the world, right? And you can kind of mix them all together in a laboratory or in a writing project and produce the mind, right, as the subject for psychology. And so that transit from very particular minds and brains to the mind or the brain, again, it happens in every period, but in this moment, there's a kind of professional or disciplinary dimension to it, which is like psychologists are saying, this is our thing. So they're defining an object that is their object out of all these particular experiences. And it's that kind of erasure of the particular. You want the particular, right? You want to know like who are the people, what are the cats, what is their experience, but they've purposefully erased it in order to produce this universal object. And that's one of those things you can point at and say, well, then make the universalizing, the erasure, part of the argument, which is, it's not as good as being able to tell stories about the particular cats in the cages, but it's part of what happened. It's part of what they were up to.
Claudio has a question, but I'm going to butt in for a second because something you just said made me think of a question, and then we'll get to Claudio's. So you talked about minds and brains. This is the title of a course that you taught at Yale and also at Michigan, right? I'm wondering one of the jobs we have to do as professors is to make our niche research subjects speak to students who may not care about the late 19th century or the 8th century. So what do you think is a kind of takeaway from your book that you've either, sort of offered through your minds and brains class, or just something that you think speaks to our contemporary culture more generally?
I think I'm going to cheat a little bit, but I think that there's a way that my answer gets at Claudio's question, which is in the chat, and which is about how studying particular scientific discourses, and sorry, Claudio, if this isn't precisely what you're asking about, but like studying, in Jamie's case, the anatomy and archaeology of pigs, what we know about them now in order to say something about them then, or in my case, this point about cognition, like thinking through cognitive heuristics now in order to tell a historical story. I think that is done carefully, a really important takeaway for students, because they tend to think of history as being totally distinct from those other ways of asking questions. Often they come in thinking history is the past, right? It's just the stuff that happened. They were forced to memorize dates in high school. They come in kind of hesitatingly into these classes. And then we try to show them that it's actually a way of thinking that's productively in conversation with other fields. So in my case, that's psychology, right? So thinking about how history reveals other ways of thinking psychologistically, or psychology is engaged in some of the same questions today as they were then. Again, you have to do it carefully, I think, but that's one of the connections that I try to draw. Do you have one, Jamie, with biology and ecology?
Yeah, and weirdly, this also, I think, speaks to Claudio's question. So I guess we were sort of on the same page anyway. I think that it's really important to communicate that the politics of the local are really important. In our current moment, everyone loves the concept of scalability, especially in late stage capitalism, like what can be transplanted seamlessly from one location to another. But in the early Middle Ages, it was so much about starting small, thinking through the interconnectivity of the system, and asking how these different parts played into something larger. To answer Claudio's question, that's changed the way I think about history and doing it, in part because I think, at least in my subfield, there was kind of a tacit understanding that the texts that we read, which were mostly written by people who were either monks or bishops or participated in kind of upper level politics, we needed to be responsible as historians and not to assume that this spoke to or represented some larger population. And at the same time, the sorts of consonances that I would see between that sort of high level intellectual material and some of the logics that govern the decisions that people made in farming communities suggested that there may be more connection and sympathy than I had anticipated. And also just, not to necessarily exclude, the realm of the agrarian from the realm of the intelligentsia or the, Christian elite. In terms of history more broadly, I was giving a talk recently where someone said, well, how would you recommend doing global history? And I think the experience of writing this book has made me not think that it's impossible, but to think, at least for me, it's so much and more important to start little and see where that takes you, because you kind of don't know what you're skipping over otherwise.
Right. That seems totally right. Jamie, we've got two, probably in my experience as your friend and colleague, maybe two of your most commonly asked questions before we get to Helmut's question. So sure. Wondering about the Jewish perspective on consuming pigs and wondering whether you yourself can consume pigs in the wake of all this knowledge that you have now.
I have not eaten pork or most meat since I was 12. Probably in some weird way that was a factor that eventually led me to working on this book, just because I've been interested in thinking about animals for a while. But I think that there also are compelling arguments for people who could by people who continue to eat meat, but are just more reflective on the process that ends up in a pork chop on their dinner table. Having more knowledge about food systems is always a good thing. Mm-hmm. As far as the Jewish element to this early medieval story, as far as we can tell, there's not an easy answer for why there is a pork taboo in Judaism. But in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, what most rabbinic scholars suggested was that there wasn't a reason for it, that God asked people to do it, asked people to refrain from eating certain things, precisely to demonstrate their obedience and respect for him, so that, it wasn't that the animal was gross or unhealthy. That would have been too easy and not at all a measure of their willingness to obey his law. And it wasn't really a touchstone as far as, it wasn't a point of contention in terms of monotheistic conflicts. Rather than seeing pork as emblematic of Christianity, the rabbis tended to see pork as emblematic of Romanness, They associated it with the Roman Empire because Romans loved pork. And even in early Islam, that's really the predominant association that you see. So it takes a really long time for pork to become Christianized in this cross-religious context. In the beginning, it sort of reads more imperial.
I can recommend Jamie's final chapter to anyone who is interested further in these questions. I'm going to take up Helmut's question, and I'll just say again, if you have a question, please just drop it in the chat. So Helmut is asking, he's boldly asked us a question, both of us, the same question. And it's about, I take it to be a kind of pun, because the question is about experience and experiment, which I think are the same in French. And the question is whether, it seems like in my book, it's mostly about experiment, and Jamie, in your book, in a way, it's about recovering experience. And so he's asking us to do the reverse. And what I would say, I have the easier one, I think. I would say that experience and experiment end up getting opposed by some of the people fighting these fights in psychology. That basically what experiment does is carve out from our actual mental lives these tiny little meaningless data that don't actually tell you anything about what it's like to live in a mind or to live in a body or to live with one another. So like your reaction time or your sensory threshold, right? These are things that don't really matter to you on a moment by moment basis. And the opponents of that, kind of hideous reduction end up touting experience, that what really matters is to provide an account of everyday experience, what it's like to walk through the world, or what it's like to be a bat, in the famous philosophical phrase. And the dilemma here is that, as anyone who's tried to write about it knows, experience in its fullness is basically impossible to render. That's why phenomenology, the branch of philosophy dedicated to experience, is essentially unreadable for most people. It's really difficult to bring across what it's like to be you, or to be human, or to be sad in written language. And a lot of that gets redounded to literature, right? It's no accident that the stream of consciousness is a theory in psychology that fully flowers as a literary method in modernism in the early 20th century. But Jamie, experiment in the early Middle Ages?
Yeah, I mean, I could do a Henry Cowles twist and be like, experiment is really about a process of thinking that we do naturally or should inhabit all of the time.
Don't do that though.
No. The closest thing that we get to experiment from the vantage point of pigs is the early exegetes really, really encouraging people to imagine themselves outside their normal vantage point in two ways. One was to just consult with people who knew better about a certain particular subject because they were professionals engaged with it constantly. So for example, you are a rich late Roman landowner, you don't know much about birds, you're trying to figure out how they piece together in the whole system of creation. What you do is you go out and talk to peasants who see birds in the field all the time, they know birds super well, go chat them up. This will be one way of you not necessarily experiencing the world, but learning through kind of intellectual experiment how to see it from a different vantage point, even if that's not sort of your professional orientation. The second kind of exercise or experiment that they invite people to do all the time is to just see the world as if they're not inhabiting the body or the self or even the species that they normally do. So, imagine that you're looking on a farm, not as a farmer, but as a ewe who's looking for her lamb, and how she finds it through its special bleat and through the smells that only she can smell. Imagine that you are an eagle with sight that's much better than a human being's. Imagine that you're a dog trying to figure out which way someone went down a path. They do this as a kind of way to unsettle people's epistemological comfort zone, to say, you don't actually know everything. Humans don't have sort of total access to what there is to know. You need to start piecing together other ways of seeing it. So there's a lot of sort of experimental acrobatics that are happening cognitively for them that they really want people to start adopting themselves.
It occurs to me too that another of the kind of tensions in this late 19th century moment is a fight over exactly what your first example was. So the fight is between people who rely on anecdotes and stories from people as their evidence, and people who do the experiments themselves. And it's this really bitter fight where the old school are portrayed as like basically watching their dogs for times they do special things and then writing it up and sending it in as a journal article. And the new school are described as basically people who hate animals and lock them up and, you know, administer these terrible tests to them with no real fellow feeling or empathy. They don't really understand animals. They think of them as basically robots. So there is this kind of, it's interesting that your experiments, these kind of anecdotal experiments or experiments with story and experience, end up being exactly the kind of the fighting words of 1890 in the discipline of psychology.
Well, I mean, speaking of the new school, we've got a question about the boring turn, which we talked about very briefly for psychology. Do you think that in the historiography of history, there's also a sort of similar turn to the boring?
So I would love your thoughts on this. I have two very initial thoughts, and thank you for the question, Nathan. So the first thought is that just like in psychology, it is the Germans who get dubbed the boring. And this is true in ancient history, it's true in lexicography, it's true in, across a range of specialties. Basically, this immense command of facts and languages and these huge compendia of history, that's kind of the move, right? The hyper empiricist turn in certain schools of historiography. But the other point is maybe even more interesting, and it's that in the discipline of history, still today, there is a discourse not of boredom, but of effort that prevails. So when you go to a job talk in history, someone is always going to talk about the number of archives they visited, the number of pages they've been through, the number of continents potentially they've been to, right? This kind of, and it might sound like bragging about traveling, but what it's really bragging about is the immense effort to produce the story that you're about to hear. Does that sound right, Jamie?
Yeah, the only other sort of moment I was thinking of was in the 70s with the turn to quantitative social history, how, those practitioners get accused of writing stuff that's so dry no one could possibly read it. At the same time, you're getting an insurgent interest in microhistory that hyper narrativizes sort of individual moments, but of course, when done responsibly, connects it to bigger trends. A lot of people argue that that's a misrepresentation of what quantitative social history was trying to do. That actually, I mean, in a similar way to your psychologists, if you really want to research something systematically, the boring has to happen. Otherwise, it is just sort of incidental on what your dog happened to be doing that day.
People are suspicious if it seems like you're having too much fun.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, I feel like this is sort of one of the challenges of writing history still, that, you need to show some of the skeleton still. Like, you need to be up. I mean, this is a responsibility, actually, I think that historians have, that, you need to remind your readers where you're getting the material, where the gaps are. And, you may not have to do it in kind of an exhaustive way that we might have done in our dissertations, but, not only is that important to remind people what the complications of the evidence are, but I think readers also like to see it a little bit too, because you're inviting them into that investigative process.
So this is so on point. I can't remember if you mentioned it in the book, Jamie, but you did take a class, right, on like basically dressing a pig, like a butchery class, to figure out exactly how it works, right? To see the skeleton, essentially. Is that right?
Yes. I mean, speaking of phenomenology, like, I don't want to draw an exact parallel between what this Brooklyn butcher was doing with the meat in 2018, because even butchery practices back in 400 were changing and variable depending on where you lived. But I was reading these archaeological reports where they'd say, the cut on the bone in this way suggests this way of, dressing the meat, and I couldn't see it. And so, I took it was only a 2 or 3 hour class. But weirdly, as I'm sure has happened to you, there's certain things that other people get really excited about hearing. That pig butchery class was more impressive to people than, whoever knows how many hours I spent reading through the Latin exegetical material. So, I mean, there must be an equivalent for you, where sort of this sort of flashy thing is a little bit more impressive than the more deeper methodologies you were engaged with.
I think the equivalent thing that occurs to me is, so like, for example, I have a good colleague here at Michigan who does work with rats, right? He works on addiction and habit formation. It's basically neuroscience work, but it's the closest thing I've seen up close, seeing the rats running through their apparatus, preparing to do these studies, to a lot of the stuff I write about. And when I start talking about that work, this recent psychological work, a lot of people get really excited in the class that I'm just talking to about it. So there's this kind of, and this gets back to some of the questions about what's boring. Some work in psychology is just automatically exciting. Like, it's just like, oh, are they going to tell us why I can't put my phone down? Like, that's, like Henry's not going to tell us that, but maybe this will tell us that. And I'm certainly not going to tell you that. So I do use those anecdotes about spending time in those laboratory spaces now as a way of kind of getting into some of this older stuff. It seems like we have a couple minutes. Is that right, Jamie?
Yeah, and this ties into another question that Claudio has. Speaking of the gap between sort of the popular imagination and the way practitioners see something, how does the sort of lay belief in the scientific method continue to still shape us now?
Oh, so I have an easy answer for this. I encourage everyone right after we're done to go to Twitter. You don't have to have Twitter to do this. And just search, in quotation marks, the scientific method. And you will see 100 times in the last hour, people going back and forth across the political spectrum, anti-vaxxers, pro-vaccination, the whole spectrum of people invoking the method against one another. And they all mean the same thing, but they're trying to undercut one another by appeal to this 5-step method that was based on observing 5-year-olds solve puzzles. So it's got this amazing kind of rhetorical and political renewal going on right now around COVID-19, around trusting the scientists, around, like, if you ask someone with a sign in the yard, trust the science, what does it mean? It doesn't mean whoever's wearing a white coat. It doesn't mean whoever got a certain degree. It means whoever is thinking and operating in the right way. And that often comes back to this method that the scientists themselves say, I don't do that, right? I do something much more complicated than that, or much simpler than that, but not that list. Do you have a similar answer?
It's a very different tone from, I remember like back when you were giving job talks, there was a totally different kind of popular imagination hook, which was the Twitter feed about, you're gonna have to tell me what the hashtag was. It was like, this is what scientific method looks like in practice. And it was a bunch of sort of coincidences and errors and,
but it was those are the scientists. Those are the same scientists, are the same people that, right? They're just being honest about what they do. Jamie, last question. Do you have an equivalent political conversation that occurs around pigs, their creativity, their status, their rights, when you tell people what you work on now?
I think there's less sort of pushback than is happening in the kind of complications of the concept of the scientific method that you offer. Most small scale farmers, none of this is really news to them. Most academics are like, great, animals are smart. I honestly will be interested, the longer this book is out, to hear from people who, just tell me if it's, made them think about their meat differently. Yeah, it's a good question and I don't have a good answer for it.
So they might not stop eating bacon, but they might
not stop eating bacon. Maybe they will, maybe they'll visit a farm first, make sure they're okay with, eating an animal that's intelligent. I mean, I just want to end by saying I don't actually buy all of these ideas about animals being smart or stupid. It's that pigs are intelligent in ways that are legible to us, and that just happen to be a little bit more obvious than other sorts of animals.
I just want to highlight that we got through this, Jamie, without making any jokes about bacon and Francis Bacon. And I think that's a real plus for us.
We did great.
Yeah, we did great.
You guys really did. Thank you so much. It's always a delight to have scholars here who are able to talk about their work in a way that even those of us without expertise in history, science, scientific method, it's really nice how you make your topics accessible and interesting. So I really appreciate it. And I appreciate you guys sharing your time and talent with all of us tonight. As a reminder to everyone in the virtual audience, both of these authors' books are available at avidbookshop.com, and we are happy to ship nationwide. And we want to thank their presses, Harvard University Press and Yale University Press. University presses are a really important part of the publishing world that a lot of folks aren't quite aware of. So if you're interested in a really particular topic, or you just want to do some deep diving, if you go to any university's website and look up their publishing house, including the one here at UGA Press, you're going to find some really interesting, fascinating scholarly work like yours at Yale and Harvard. So thank you both. We so appreciate you being here, and we really love that all of you showed up tonight for these two authors. It was such a treat, and we hope to talk to y'all again and maybe host you in the store someday when it's safe to do so.
Thanks everybody for coming.
Thanks, Janet. Thanks, everyone.
Good night, all.